Sawada Coffee was packed. On a Saturday morning in Chicago, the small space on Green Street felt even smaller. The air smelled like burnt sugar, espresso, and the damp wool of coats worn by people escaping the wind outside. Every wooden stool was taken. People leaned against the brick walls, holding paper cups and staring at their phones. David Miller sat at table 7, a small circular spot near the window. His 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, was busy tearing a croissant into tiny pieces. David watched her, his mind elsewhere. He had exactly $40 left in his checking account. He had spent the last 2 months applying for every operations manager job in the city. So far, he had received 24 automated rejection emails. Today was supposed to be a break from the stress. The heavy front door opened, letting in a gust of cold air. A young woman stepped inside. She was dressed in a dark wool coat, but it was the aluminum crutches that caught David's eye. She moved slowly, her movements practiced but heavy. Her right pant leg was pinned up at the knee. She stopped just inside the door and scanned the room. David saw her eyes land on a table where a student sat with a laptop spread out. The woman walked over. David could hear her voice over the hum of the espresso machine. "Excuse me, do you think I could use the other half of this table? I just need to sit for a few minutes." The student didn't look up from the screen. "I'm actually waiting for a study group. All these seats are taken." The woman nodded. "I understand. Thank you anyway." She moved toward the middle of the room. A couple sat at a booth, their chairs pulled close together. She approached them next. "Hi, would you mind if I shared this space? It's very crowded today." The woman at the booth looked at the crutches and then at her partner. "We are actually celebrating our anniversary. We were hoping for some privacy." The young woman apologized and turned away. David watched her shoulders drop. She looked toward a man reading a newspaper at a high-top table. Before she could even get close, the man shook his head and turned his page. She stood in the center of the cafe, looking at the floor. She looked like she was about to leave. Then her eyes met David's. He didn't look away. He didn't look at her leg. He just saw a person who was tired. She walked toward table 7. She stopped a few feet away, her hands gripping the handles of her crutches. "May I share this table?" David reached out and pulled the empty chair toward her. "Of course. Please, have a seat. We're almost finished with our snack anyway." She leaned her crutches against the brick wall and sat down. "Thank you. Truly. I've been to 3 different places this morning and couldn't find a spot." "It's a busy Saturday," David said. "I'm David. This is Chloe." Chloe looked up from her croissant. "Why do you have those sticks?" "Chloe," David said quietly. "We talked about being polite." "It's okay," the woman said. She looked at Chloe. "I'm Alex. I use these to help me walk because my right leg is gone." "Did it fall off?" Chloe asked. "Something like that. There was a very big accident a few years ago. Now I'm like a puzzle with a missing piece." Chloe nodded as if that made perfect sense. "My dad says we have to be careful with puzzles. If you lose a piece, you have to look really hard for it." Alex looked at David. "She's very smart, sometimes too smart," David said. "Are you getting anything to drink? The line is a bit long, but I can go get something for you if you'd like." Alex checked her watch. "I shouldn't. I just wanted to sit here for a while." David looked at her. She looked pale. He stood up. "Stay here with Chloe. I'll be right back." David walked to the counter. He looked at his banking app on his phone. $38. He ordered a large hot cocoa with extra whipped cream and a black coffee. When he returned to the table, he set the cocoa in front of Alex. "I didn't order this," Alex said. "It's the best thing they make here," David told her. "And it's too cold outside to just sit with nothing. Please." Alex reached for the cup. She wrapped her hands around it as if she were trying to catch the heat. She took a sip and closed her eyes. "Thank you, David. You have no idea how much I needed this." They sat in silence for a few minutes. Chloe began drawing on a paper napkin with a crayon she found in her pocket. "Do you live nearby?" David asked. "No, I live in a condo downtown, but I grew up a few blocks from here," Alex said. "Every Saturday morning, my dad would bring me, my mom, and my sister to this exact cafe. We always sat at a window table. My sister would order strawberry muffins, and my dad would tell bad jokes. That sounds like a good tradition, David said. It was. They're all gone now. The same accident that took my leg took them, too. Alex looked out the window at the gray Chicago sky. I haven't been back here since it happened. But today is my 27th birthday. I woke up and realized I couldn't spend it in a boardroom or a quiet apartment. I needed to be somewhere that felt like they were still here. David felt a lump in his throat. He looked at his daughter, then back at Alex. Happy birthday, Alex. I'm glad you asked to sit here. Me too, Chloe added, handing Alex the napkin. She had drawn a messy yellow sun. This is for your birthday. Alex took the napkin. Her fingers trembled slightly. I'm going to keep this forever. The three of them talked for another half hour. Alex asked David what he did for a living. I'm in between things, David said. Logistics and operations. I have a big interview on Monday morning. Actually, I'm a bit nervous about it. Where is the interview? Alex asked. Vance Enterprises, David said. It's a huge energy company. I've heard the CEO is a shark. Very cold, very demanding. But it's the only lead I have left. Alex set her cup down. Her expression changed. The softness in her eyes vanished, replaced by something sharp and unreadable. She looked at the clock on the wall and reached for her crutches. I have to go, she said. She stood up, balancing herself carefully. Did I say something wrong? David asked, standing up to help her. No, Alex said. She tucked Chloe's napkin into her coat pocket. Good luck with your interview, David. I hope you get exactly what you're looking for. She turned and moved toward the door. David watched her go, feeling a strange sense of unease. He looked down at the table. She had left her scarf behind. He grabbed it and ran to the door, but the sidewalk was already crowded with people, and Alex was nowhere to be seen. David went back to the table and picked up the scarf. It was expensive silk. He folded it and put it in his bag, thinking he might never see her again. He didn't know that on Monday morning, he would be standing in a glass office on the 60th floor of the Vance building. He also didn't know that the woman he had just bought a $4 cocoa for was currently the most powerful person in that building. The rest of the weekend was a blur for David. He spent Sunday washing his only suit and polishing his shoes while Chloe played with her crayons. He kept looking at the silk scarf Alex had left behind. It sat on his kitchen table, a quiet reminder of a strange, kind morning. But as Monday arrived, the warmth of the cafe was replaced by the cold reality of the Chicago loop. David stood in front of his mirror at 7 a.m., straightened his tie, and headed toward the train. By 8:45 a.m., David was standing in the lobby of Vance Tower. The ceiling was high, made of glass and steel that hummed with the energy of hundreds of people moving toward elevators. He felt out of place. Most men wore suits that cost more than his car. He checked in at the security desk and was directed to the HR office on the 4th floor. A woman with a sharp bob and a name tag that read Brenda sat behind a wide desk. She didn't look up when David approached. I'm David Miller. I have a 9 o'clock interview for the operations supervisor position. Brenda finally looked up. Her eyes traveled from his scuffed shoes to the slightly short sleeves of his jacket. She pulled a folder from a stack. You're early, Mr. Miller. I wanted to make sure I found the office okay. I'm very interested in this role. Brenda opened his file and frowned. I see a 6-month gap in your employment. What were you doing during that time? I'm a single father. My daughter went through a hard time, and I needed to be home. I spent the time taking online certifications in logistics management. Brenda closed the folder immediately. Vance Enterprises doesn't hire people who prioritize personal issues over their career. We need people who are available 24/7. I am available. My daughter is in school now, and I have childcare set up. My experience at Amazon shows I can handle high-pressure environments. It shows you could handle it. Now, it shows you're a risk. To be honest, you don't fit the image we want for our supervisors. I was told this was a preliminary interview. I have the qualifications. I am the head of HR, Mr. Miller. I just gave you your interview, and you didn't pass. We're looking for elite talent, not people who look like they've been out of the game for too long." David gripped the strap of his bag. "You haven't even asked me about my technical skills. I don't need to. I've been doing this for 20 years. I know who is Vance material and who isn't. You can leave now." David stood there for a second, his heart sinking. He thought about Chloe and the $40 left in his pocket. He wanted to argue, but Brenda was already looking at her computer. He turned and walked out of the office. As he waited for the elevator, he felt a deep sense of failure. He had pinned everything on this job. He reached the lobby and headed for the revolving doors. He didn't notice a private elevator opening near the back of the hall. Alexandra Vance stepped out, supported by her crutches. She was dressed in a sharp black suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, professional bun. She looked cold and distant, the complete opposite of the woman in the cafe. Brenda was already standing in the lobby, waiting to greet her. "Good morning, Miss Vance. You have a busy schedule today." Alex didn't answer. She stopped and watched the glass doors. She saw a man in a dark, old suit walking out onto the street. Brenda, who was that man? Just a waste of time, Miss Vance, an applicant for the operations job. He had a huge gap in his resume. I sent him away. Alex turned her head slowly. Did he have an appointment? Well, yes, but he wasn't right for us. His resume was a junk file. I've already marked him as a rejection. Alex leaned heavily on her crutches, her eyes narrowing. Bring that resume to my office. Right now. But Miss Vance, I have much better candidates. I don't care about the other candidates. Bring me his file. 10 minutes later, Alex sat in her office on the 60th floor. She opened the folder Brenda had placed on her desk. She stared at the name David Miller. She looked at his photo and his work history. Then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the paper napkin Chloe had drawn on. She placed it next to David's resume. A small, tight smile appeared on her face, but her eyes remained sharp. She picked up the phone. Brenda, call Mr. Miller back. Ma'am, I already told him he was rejected. Then tell him you made a mistake. Tell him he has an interview tomorrow at 8 o'clock sharp. And Brenda, yes, Miss Vance? Tell him the CEO will be interviewing him personally. And tell him to wear that same suit. David sat on a bench at the Clark and Lake station, staring at the CTA tracks. He had his phone in his hand, ready to call Marcus and tell him the suit didn't work and the interview was a disaster. He had just started typing a text when his phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unknown number. He answered it on the second ring, expecting another telemarketer. Is this David Miller? Yes, this is David. This is Brenda from Vance Enterprises. I'm calling to inform you that there has been a change in our schedule. Miss Vance would like to see you for a direct interview this afternoon. Can you be back at the tower in 20 minutes? David stood up so fast he almost dropped his bag. Miss Vance, the CEO? That is what I said, Mr. Miller. Take the private elevator in the rear of the lobby directly to the 60th floor. Do not be late. The line went dead before David could ask why the head of HR sounded like she had just swallowed a lemon. He didn't waste time thinking. He ran back toward the Vance building, his heart thumping against his ribs. He didn't understand why the most powerful woman in Chicago wanted to talk to a guy who had just been rejected 4 hours ago. But he wasn't going to miss the chance. When he reached the 60th floor, the doors opened into a world of glass and white marble. It was silent, except for the distant hum of the city far below. Mrs. Higgins was waiting for him at a large mahogany desk. Mr. Miller? Miss Vance is expecting you. You can head straight in. David wiped his palms on his trousers and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray expanse of Lake Michigan. A woman sat behind a desk that looked like a solid block of wood. She was looking at a computer screen, her hair tied back so tightly it looked painful. She was wearing a sharp charcoal suit that screamed authority. David stopped in the middle of the room. He felt the air leave his lungs. It was her. It was the woman from the cafe. The woman who had cried over a paper napkin and told him about her dead parents. Alex? The woman didn't look up from her screen. Sit down, mister. Miller. David hesitated, his feet frozen. I didn't realize. From the cafe, I thought. This is a professional interview, Mr. Miller. Please take a seat so we can begin. David sat in the leather chair across from her. He waited for her to smile, or to thank him for the cocoa, or to mention Chloe. Instead, she finally looked at him, and her eyes were as cold as the lake outside. There was no recognition in them. There was no warmth. It was as if the person he had met on Saturday had been a ghost. "I've reviewed your file," she said, tapping a pen against a printed copy of his resume. "You spent 8 years at Amazon. You managed 300 people and handled a budget of $50 million. Your efficiency ratings were in the top 5% for the region." "That's correct. I built those teams from the ground up. Then why did you leave?" As I told the HR director, I had personal matters that required my full attention. My daughter needed stability. Stability doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Miller. In this industry, if you step away for 6 months, you're behind. Why should I believe you can still handle the pace of Vance Enterprises? Logistics is about problem solving. That doesn't change because I spent a few months at home. If anything, being a parent has made me more efficient. I don't have time to waste. Alex leaned back in her chair. She didn't look convinced. "We have a crisis in our Midwest distribution center. We're losing 2% of our inventory to shipping errors every month." "How would you fix it?" David didn't blink. He knew this part. "I'd start by auditing the last mile software. Usually, errors like that aren't human. They're systemic. I'd retrain the floor supervisors on real-time tracking and implement a double-check protocol for high-value crates. That takes time and money. I want results in 30 days. Then you'd get them. I've done more with less." Alex watched him for a long moment. She picked up a paperweight and set it back down. The silence in the room was heavy. "Brenda rejected you this morning," Alex said. "She's the best HR director in the city. She said you weren't Vance material. She said you didn't fit the image of this company." David looked at the expensive art on the walls and then back at Alex. "I know what she said. So tell me, Mr. Miller, why should I hire someone that my own HR department already threw away?" David leaned forward. He thought about the cafe. He thought about the empty chairs and the people who had turned their backs on a woman who just wanted to sit down. He saw the same coldness in this office that he had seen in the cafe. But this time, he was the one asking for a spot, because I am the person who understands the value of a seat when everyone else is telling me to keep moving. I know what it's like to be overlooked, and that makes me work harder than anyone else you'll hire. I don't need a fancy suit or a perfect resume to do the job. I just need the table. Alex didn't move. She didn't blink. Her face was a mask of stone. She looked at him as if she were trying to see right through his skin. Then she slowly closed his folder and placed it on top of a stack of papers. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller." David felt a cold pit in his stomach. "That's it? I have all the information I need. You should head home and wait for a notification from our system. If we decide to move forward, you'll be contacted through the usual channels." "Alex, wait. About the cafe. That will be all, David." David stood up. He felt a mix of anger and confusion. He had been sure there was a connection between them, but now he felt like he had imagined the whole thing. He picked up his bag and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He took the elevator all the way down to the lobby and stepped out into the humid Chicago afternoon. He walked 3 blocks before he realized his hands were shaking. He reached into his bag for a bottle of water, but his fingers brushed against something else. He pulled it out. It was a small, white envelope that hadn't been in his bag when he arrived at the tower. There was no name on the front. He tore it open and pulled out a single slip of paper. It wasn't a job offer. It was a handwritten address for a warehouse on the south side of the city and a time, 10 p.m. tonight. At the bottom of the note, there were only 3 words: "Don't be late." David took the red line toward the south side address on the note. He had spent the last 2 hours wondering if the warehouse was a trick or some kind of unofficial test. He had left Chloe with Marcus, promising to be back by midnight. As he walked toward the massive industrial complex near Englewood, the silence was heavy. The Vance Enterprises logo was the only thing lit up on the side of the gray building. He pushed open a heavy metal door. Inside, the warehouse was a mess. Crates were stacked in the wrong aisles. Forklifts sat idle in the middle of the floor. There were no workers in sight, but the lights were humming loudly. David walked toward the center of the bay, his shoes echoing on the concrete. "You're early." David looked up. Alex was standing on a metal catwalk, 15 feet above him. She was still in her charcoal suit, but she had her crutches tucked under her arms. She looked down at him without a smile. "I said 10 o'clock, she said. "It's 10 to 10, David replied. "I wanted to see the facility before we talked." "What do you see?" David looked at a stack of electronics leaning precariously against a support beam. "I see $40,000 in potential damage. I see a floor plan that hasn't been updated in 5 years, and I see why your inventory numbers are down." Alex moved toward the stairs. She navigated the steps slowly but with a focus that made David stay quiet. When she reached the floor, she stopped a few feet away from him. "This is the heart of my Midwest operation," Alex said, "and it's failing. My uncle thinks it's because the manager is lazy. My HR director thinks it's because the neighborhood is bad. I think it's because no one has actually bothered to lead. Why am I here, Alex?" "Don't call me that in this building," she said. Her voice was flat. "You are here because you told me you know the value of a seat. I want to see if you know the value of mine. Go home, Mr. Miller. Your daughter is waiting. Did I pass? Check your phone at 11. David didn't ask anything else. He turned and walked out. The ride back to Logan Square felt longer than the ride down. He picked up Chloe from Marcus's place. The little girl was asleep, her head resting on Marcus's old couch. David carried her home, tucked her into bed, and sat at his small kitchen table. He stared at the clock on the wall. On Elibesh. On Elibesh. He had exactly $42 left. If this didn't work, he'd have to call his landlord tomorrow and ask for an extension he knew he wouldn't get. He put his phone on the table. The screen stayed black. Then, at exactly 11 p.m., the phone vibrated. He swiped the screen. It was an email from a generic Vance Enterprises address. Subject: Offer of employment. Senior Operations Supervisor. David felt his heart skip. He clicked the attachment. The salary was twice what he had made at Amazon. There was a signing bonus that would cover his rent for the next 6 months. He leaned back in his chair, a long breath escaping his lungs. He wanted to scream, but he didn't want to wake Chloe. He scrolled down to the second attachment. It was labeled Vance Protocol, Standard Operating Procedures. David opened it, expecting a standard employee handbook. Instead, he found 50 pages of the most intense rules he had ever seen. Rule 1. All supervisors must be on the floor 30 minutes prior to shift start. No exceptions. Rule 4. Communication with the CEO's office is restricted to formal reports unless otherwise requested. Rule 12. Professional attire is required at all times, including warehouse hours. Rule 27. Personal phone usage is strictly prohibited during operational hours. As he read further, David realized this wasn't just a company, it was Alex's fortress. Every rule was designed to keep people at a distance. Every protocol was built to ensure that no one could make a mistake without it being tracked. He realized that the woman he had met in the cafe, the one who cried over a sun drawing, was buried under layers of iron and ice. She wasn't giving him a job because she liked him. She was giving him a job to see if he would break under her rules. He thought about the cocoa. He thought about the silk scarf still sitting on his dresser. "I won't let you down," he whispered to the empty room. He spent the next hour reading every single page. He memorized the reporting structure. He studied the inventory codes. He realized that if he made one mistake, Alex would fire him without a second thought. She had to. If she showed him favor, her uncle and the board would use it against her. He was her gamble, and he had to be perfect. He went to his dresser and pulled out his old suit. He started ironing it again. He looked at the silk scarf. He realized he couldn't return it to her tomorrow. Not at the office. Rule 4 made that clear. He would have to wait. He checked the time. It was 1 a.m. He had to be at the South Side warehouse by 7:30 a.m. to meet the 30-minute rule. He set his alarm for 5:30. David walked into Chloe's room. He watched her sleep for a moment. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months, but beneath it was a new kind of tension. He was finally back in the game, but the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. He went back to the kitchen to turn off the light. As he reached for the switch, his phone buzzed again. It was a text message. Not an email, but a text. It was from the same unknown number that had called him earlier. "I hope you read the handbook, David, especially Rule 50. David scrambled to open the PDF again. He scrolled all the way to the bottom. His eyes widened as he read the final line of the document. Rule 50. All senior staff are required to attend a private introductory dinner at the Vance estate on their first evening. Transportation will arrive at 7 p.m. No guests allowed." David stared at the screen. The Vance estate. Her home. He looked at Chloe's closed door. No guests allowed meant he couldn't bring Chloe, and Marcus was working the night shift tomorrow. He looked at the text message again. It felt like a trap. Or maybe it was just another test to see if he could solve a problem on short notice. He sat down and put his head in his hands. He had the job, but the first day hadn't even started, and he was already facing a choice that could end his career before it began. The phone screen dimmed, leaving him in the dark. He had 6 hours to find a way to be a father and a supervisor at the same time, and Alex was watching every second. David managed to survive the first night. He had called Marcus, who agreed to swap his shift at the garage so he could stay with Chloe. The dinner at the Vance estate had been a cold, formal affair. Alex sat at the head of a table that could seat 30 people, looking every bit the untouchable CEO. She barely spoke to him, focusing instead on the quarterly projections and the failures of the previous management. David had followed Rule 4 to the letter, keeping his answers brief and professional. 3 weeks into the job, the routine was set. David was at the South Side warehouse by 7:15 a.m. every day. He wore a clean suit, kept his hair neat, and didn't touch his personal phone until he stepped outside the gates. Alex visited the floor twice a week. When she did, she was harsher on David than on anyone else. "Mr. Miller, the loading dock efficiency in Sector B dropped by 4% yesterday," Alex said, standing in the middle of the warehouse floor. Her voice carried across the quiet room. "Is there a reason for this lapse?" "We had a hydraulic leak on one of the lifts, Miss Vance. We had to reroute the crates manually. A leak is a maintenance failure. Maintenance falls under your supervision. I expect a full report on the preventative measures you're implementing by 5 o'clock. I'll have it on your desk. See that you do. I don't pay for excuses." She turned and walked away, her crutches clicking rhythmically against the concrete floor. David watched her go. He saw the way the other workers looked at him, half with pity, half with relief that they weren't the ones in her sights. David didn't mind. He knew she was protecting herself. If she showed him any kindness, the board would call it favoritism. If she was tough, she was just being a boss. By the 4th week, the weather in Chicago turned. A wet, biting wind blew off the lake, and the temperature inside the warehouse dropped despite the heaters. David noticed Alex was limping more than usual during her Friday inspection. Her face was pale, and she kept shifting her weight. David stayed late that evening to finish the logistics map for the holiday rush. It was 8:30 p.m. Most of the office staff had gone home. He walked toward the elevators but stopped when he saw the lights still on in the executive suite. He moved closer and saw Alex through the glass wall. She was sitting on her sofa, her prosthetic leg unclipped and resting on the coffee table. She was rubbing the stump of her leg, her eyes closed in a way that looked like she was fighting back tears. She looked exhausted. The sharp CEO was gone, replaced by the tired woman from the cafe. David walked to the reception desk. Mrs. Higgins was still there, organizing files. "Mrs. Higgins. Is she all right?" David asked quietly. "The cold is always hard on her, David. It makes the nerves in her leg flare up. But she won't go home until the work is done. Has she eaten? Just black coffee since noon?" David looked at the closed office door. He wanted to go in. He wanted to tell her to stop, but Rule 4 and Rule 50 stood in his way. He looked at the silk scarf in his bag, which he still carried every day, hoping for a moment to return it. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small box of ginger tea he had bought for Chloe's stomach and a reusable heat pack he kept for his own sore back. He placed them on Mrs. Higgins' desk. "Can you do me a favor?" David asked. "What is it?" "Take these in to her. Tell her you thought she looked cold. Don't mention me. Just tell her to drink the tea and use the pack on her leg." Mrs. Higgins looked at the items and then at David. "She's very observant, David. I know. Just tell her it was your idea. She needs it." David walked away before Mrs. Higgins could argue. He took the elevator down and walked out into the cold night air. He felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. He was following her rules, but he was also breaking the spirit of them. Inside the office, Mrs. Higgins knocked on the door. She walked in with a steaming mug and the activated heat pack. "I thought you could use this, Alexandra," Mrs. Higgins said. Alex opened her doughy mat and looked at the mug. She took it and smelled the ginger. She looked at the heat pack, which was a specific brand sold at a small pharmacy near Logan Square. She knew Mrs. Higgins lived in the suburbs and only drank Earl Grey. "Where did this come from, Martha? I just thought you looked like you were in pain." Alex took a sip of the tea. It was exactly the right temperature. She looked out the window at the city lights. She knew David Miller lived in Logan Square. She knew he was the only one who had seen her cry. She felt the warmth of the tea spreading through her chest. "He's still at his desk, isn't he?" Alex asked. "He just left." Alex leaned back and placed the heat pack over her leg. The throbbing pain began to dull. She felt a small smile tug at her lips. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out the paper napkin Chloe had drawn on. She looked at the sun. "He's going to get himself fired," Alex whispered to the empty room. The next Monday, David arrived at his desk to find a small, formal envelope. There was no name on it, only a Vance Enterprises seal. He opened it. Rule 4, Amendment, direct communication with the CEO is permitted during after-hours operations if it pertains to the welfare of the staff. The tea was acceptable. The heat pack was better. Do not let it happen again. David felt a surge of hope. He looked toward the executive elevators. For the first time, the rules didn't feel like a cage. They felt like a conversation. He worked through the morning, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He coordinated the new shipping schedule and managed a conflict between two drivers. Around 2 p.m., he went to the break room to get water. He stopped when he saw Brenda, the HR director, talking to a man he didn't recognize. The man was older, wearing an expensive suit and a look of pure arrogance. "I don't care how much Alex likes his numbers," the man was saying. His voice was loud and sharp. "Mr. Miller is a liability. He's too close to her. My sources say they've been seen together outside the office. We're watching him." "Howard," Brenda replied, "I've already started the file. One more slip-up, one more kindness, and I'll have enough to terminate him for violating the ethics code." "Good. My niece needs to learn that she doesn't run this company alone. Get rid of him by the end of the week." David stood frozen behind the vending machine. He realized the rules weren't just for him and Alex. They were the only things keeping him safe from the people who wanted to destroy her. He looked at the water bottle in his hand. He had to tell Alex, but if he did, he would be walking right into Howard's trap. David turned to walk back to his desk, but he ran straight into Mrs. Higgins. She looked at him, her eyes wide with worry. "David, you need to come with me," she whispered. "Now, Mrs. Higgins pulled David into a small supply closet and shut the door. The air smelled like floor wax and paper. She looked at David with a sharp, worried focus. "You heard them, didn't you?" "I heard enough," David said. "Howard and Brenda, they want me gone by Friday. It's worse than that. David, Howard, hired a private investigator. He has photos of you, Chloe, and Alexandra at Sawada Coffee. He's going to tell the board that she hired an unqualified friend. He's calling it a breach of ethics." David felt a cold weight in his chest. "I didn't even know who she was. We were just sharing a table because the place was full. It doesn't matter what the truth is. Howard only cares about the optics. He's in the boardroom right now with the senior partners." He's laying the groundwork to remove her. I have to tell her. You can't. If you're seen near her today, it just proves his point. Go to the Southside warehouse. Stay there. Do your job so well that they can't find a single flaw." David nodded. He left the building through the service exit to avoid being seen and caught a cab to the south side. He needed to be invisible. He needed to be perfect. When he arrived at the warehouse, the floor was buzzing. Trucks were backing into the bays, and the night shift was handing over to the morning crew. David went straight to his small, glass-walled office and pulled up the master inventory logs. He didn't take a break. He didn't look at his phone. He spent 4 hours auditing every single crate that moved through the facility. Around 3 p.m., David noticed something strange in the digital ledger. A shipment of high-end solar inverters in Sector C had been marked as water-damaged and total loss. He frowned. Sector C was in the center of the building. There were no pipes in that area, and the roof had been replaced over the summer. He opened the detailed report. The signature on the inventory override wasn't a floor supervisor's. It was Howard Vance's digital ID. David leaned into the screen. $200,000 in electronics just disappeared. He pulled the security footage for Sector C from the previous night. He watched the screen as a black, unmarked truck backed into Bay 12 at 2 a.m. 3 men who weren't on the company payroll loaded the damaged crates into the truck. Howard Vance was standing by the loading dock, checking off a clipboard. He didn't look like a man dealing with a loss. He looked like a man making a sale. David realized this was the plan. Howard wasn't just trying to fire David. He was sabotaging the warehouse efficiency to make Alex look incompetent. He was stealing inventory and blaming it on operational failures under her leadership. Back at the downtown tower, the boardroom was tense. Howard stood at the head of the long mahogany table. He tossed a manila envelope onto the center of the desk. Photos spilled out. David pulling out a chair for Alex. Chloe laughing with her. Alex holding a paper napkin. "She's compromised," Howard said. His voice was smooth and confident. "She hired a man with no executive experience because he bought her a coffee. Our Midwest numbers are tanking, and she's playing house with a warehouse manager." Alex sat at the other end of the table. Her hands were folded on top of the desk. She didn't look at the photos. Mr. Miller was the most qualified candidate for the role. His performance metrics are already better than the last 3 supervisors we had. Performance metrics can be faked, Alexandra, Howard replied. But the fact remains that you bypassed the HR director's recommendation to hire a personal acquaintance. The board cannot overlook this kind of favoritism, while we are losing hundreds of thousands in inventory. Inventory loss is a systemic issue I am currently investigating, Alex said. Investigating? Or covering up for your new friend? Howard looked at the other board members. I move for an immediate suspension of the CEO until a full ethics audit can be completed. Alex felt the room turning against her. She looked at the faces of the men who had known her father. They were looking at the photos. They were looking at her prosthetic leg. They were looking for any reason to doubt her. At the warehouse, David was frantically trying to download the security footage onto a thumb drive. His hands were shaking. He knew if he called Alex, Howard would use the phone logs as proof of their collusion. He had to get there in person. He grabbed his bag and ran toward the exit. As he reached the loading dock, a black SUV pulled up, blocking his path. Brenda stepped out of the back seat. She was accompanied by 2 large security guards. "Mr. Miller," Brenda said. She held up a formal document. "You are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Please hand over your ID badge and leave the premises." "Brenda, listen to me. I found something. Howard is stealing from the company." Brenda didn't even blink. "I don't care about your accusations. You're done here. Give me the badge. I need to speak to Alex." "You won't be speaking to anyone. Hand it over, or these gentlemen will remove you by force." David looked at the guards and then at the thumb drive in his pocket. He was miles away from the loop. The board vote was happening in less than 30 minutes. If he didn't get this footage to the 60th floor, Alex would lose everything, and it would be his fault for asking her to share a table. David backed away from Brenda. "I'm not going anywhere. Secure him," Brenda barked. The 2 guards moved forward. David didn't have a plan, but he had a logistics mindset. He looked at the idle forklift to his right. The keys were in the ignition. He jumped onto the seat and slammed the lever into gear. "Miller! Stop!" Brenda screamed. David didn't stop. He swung the forklift toward the back exit of the warehouse, forcing the guards to dive out of the way. He drove through the plastic curtains and out into the alleyway. He crashed the forklift into a stack of empty pallets to block the SUV's path and jumped off. He ran toward the main street, waving his arms at a passing yellow cab. "Vance Tower!" David yelled as he jumped into the back seat. "I'll give you $100 if you get me there in 20 minutes. The driver looked at David's panicked face and the expensive suit. He slammed on the gas. David pulled out his phone. He had one chance. He didn't call Alex. He called Marcus. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me. It's going to sound crazy, but I need you to get to Vance Tower. You still have that old messenger uniform from your courier days? In the back of my closet. Why? Put it on. I need you to get a thumb drive past security. They're looking for me, but they aren't looking for you." "David, what's going on?" "I'm trying to save a seat at the table, Marcus. Just get there." David watched the Chicago skyline get closer. He looked at the time. 3:45 p.m. The vote was at 4. He checked his bag to make sure the thumb drive was still there. He realized he had left his phone in the cab when he reached the building. He jumped out and saw Marcus standing by the revolving doors, wearing a faded blue vest and holding a clipboard. "You got it?" Marcus whispered. "Right here," David said, handing him the drive. "Take it to Mrs. Higgins on the 60th floor. Tell her it's from Logan Square." Marcus nodded and disappeared into the lobby. David stood on the sidewalk, watching the elevators through the glass. He saw Marcus get into a lift. Then he saw Brenda's black SUV pull up to the curb. Brenda stepped out and pointed at David. "There he is. Get him." David didn't run. He stood his ground. He had done everything he could. Now, it was up to the woman who had once asked a stranger for a seat. Inside the boardroom, the chairman cleared his throat. "The motion for suspension is on the floor. All in favor?" Howard raised his hand, a smug grin on his face. He looked at the others, waiting for the wave of hands to follow. Just then, the door to the boardroom swung open. Mrs. Higgins walked in, her face pale but determined. She ignored Howard and walked straight to Alex, placing a small black thumb drive on the table. "This just arrived. Alexandra, Mrs. Higgins said. From Logan Square." Alex looked at the drive. She looked at Howard. She saw the flash of panic in her uncle's eyes. She slowly reached out and picked up the drive. "Before we vote," Alex said, her voice like steel, "I think there is one more report we need to review." The boardroom doors finally opened at 5:30 p.m. David stood near the elevators, his heart racing. He saw the board members walking out in silence, their faces grim. Howard followed them, but he wasn't smug anymore. He was flanked by Thom Tu Rodriguez and 2 uniformed officers. Howard didn't look at David. He looked at the floor, his hands gripped tightly at his sides as they led him toward a service elevator. Brenda followed behind, her head down, carrying a cardboard box of her personal items. Mrs. Higgins walked over to David. She looked exhausted but relieved. "The footage was enough," she whispered. "The board has suspended Howard indefinitely pending a criminal investigation. Alex is safe, David, and you're officially reinstated." "Is she okay?" David asked. "She's in her office. She hasn't come out since the vote. I think she just needs a minute." David stayed. He sent a text to Marcus, asking him to keep Chloe for dinner. The rain had started, a heavy Chicago downpour that blurred the lights of the city. By 8 p.m., the 60th floor was dark. Mrs. Higgins had gone home, leaving David as the only person left in the lobby. He sat at his desk, finishing a backlog of emails, but his eyes kept drifting toward the heavy oak doors of the executive suite. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the quiet floor. It sounded like a heavy chair hitting the glass. David didn't think. He ran toward the office and pushed the doors open. The room was dark, lit only by the flashes of lightning outside. He saw Alex on the floor near her desk. Her prosthetic leg was unclipped, lying a few feet away from her. She was clutching the edge of the sofa, her face pressed into the fabric. "Alex, what happened?" David knelt beside her. He reached out to help her up, but she pulled away. "Don't, just leave me alone." "David, you're on the floor. I'm not leaving you here. I just wanted to get to the sofa," Alex said. Her voice was thick with tears. The socket was rubbing all day. "I tried to unclip it, but I lost my balance. I'm fine. Just go home to Chloe." David didn't listen. He moved closer and placed his hands under her arms. "I'm going to lift you to the sofa. Ready?" He lifted her gently. She felt lighter than she looked. He placed her on the cushions and moved her prosthetic leg to the corner of the room so she wouldn't have to look at it. He grabbed a throw blanket from the chair and draped it over her. Alex didn't look at him. She stared at the window, watching the rain hit the glass. Then she started to cry. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was the sound of someone who had been holding their breath for 3 years. "I can't do this anymore," Alex whispered. "You just won, Alex. Howard is gone. The company is yours. It's not just Howard. It's all of it. Every day I wake up and I have to put on this suit and this leg and pretend I'm as strong as my father was. I have to be a shark, because if I'm not, they'll eat me alive. They see the crutches and they think I'm weak. They see the woman and they think I'm a placeholder. You aren't a placeholder. You're the best CEO this company has ever had. I'm a 27-year-old girl who misses her mom," she snapped, finally looking at him. Her eyes were red and streaming. "I want to be able to walk to a cafe without people staring. I want to be able to fall down without it being a corporate disaster. I'm so tired of being Vance. I'm just tired, David." David didn't try to give her a motivational speech. He didn't tell her it would get easier. He just sat on the floor next to the sofa, his back against the leather. "My wife left because I wasn't enough for her," David said quietly. "I spent a year thinking I was a failure because I couldn't keep a marriage together and a job at the same time. I felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, too." Alex looked down at him. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "What did you do?" "I stopped trying to fix the puzzle and just started living with the pieces I had. Some days are bad. Some days I can't pay the rent. But then Chloe draws a sun on a napkin, and I realize the puzzle doesn't have to be perfect to be a good picture." Alex leaned forward. She hesitated for a second, then lowered her head until it rested on David's shoulder. She smelled like ginger tea and rain. "Thank you for the thumb drive," she said, "and for the cocoa, and for not looking at me like I'm broken." "You aren't broken, Alex. You're just human. People in this building forget that's allowed." They sat there for a long time. David didn't move, and Alex didn't pull away. The sound of the Chicago storm filled the room, but inside, it felt quiet for the first time in weeks. There was no talk of the board, or the warehouse, or the ethics code. There was just a man and a woman sitting in the dark, finding a bit of peace in a city that never stopped moving. Eventually, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Alex lifted her head and smoothed her hair back. She looked at David, and for the first time, she gave him a real smile. It wasn't the CEO's smile. It was the one from the cafe. "You should get home to Chloe," Alex said. "She'll be wondering where her dad is. Are you going to be okay?" "I will be. Mrs. Higgins is coming by in the morning to help me move some things. I think I'm going to take a few days off. For the first time in 3 years, I think the company can survive without me for a weekend." David stood up and reached for his bag. "That sounds like a good plan. See you on Monday?" "Actually, David," Alex said as he walked toward the door, "can you do me a favor?" "Anything. Take the silk scarf with you, the one I left at the cafe. I want you to keep it until the next time we share a table. It feels like good luck." David smiled. "I'll see you at Sawada on Saturday?" "Saturday," Alex agreed. David walked out of the office and into the elevator. He felt a sense of relief he couldn't explain. He hadn't told her he loved her, and she hadn't promised him a future. But as he stepped out into the damp Chicago night, he knew everything had changed. He reached into his bag to check for his keys, but his fingers hit a hard, plastic object he didn't recognize. He pulled it out. It was a black electronic tracker, no bigger than a coin. It was taped to the bottom of his laptop bag. A red light on the side was blinking steadily. David looked up at the glowing windows of the 60th floor. Howard was gone, but someone was still watching. He realized that the victory in the boardroom might have just been the start of a much more dangerous game. He smashed the tracker under his heel and looked around the empty street. A black SUV was idling at the corner, its headlights off. As soon as David looked at it, the vehicle accelerated and disappeared into the fog. David gripped his bag and started walking toward the train station, his eyes scanning every shadow. He had to get to Chloe. He had to get home. He didn't know who was following him, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just a warehouse manager anymore. He was the only thing standing between Alex and a shadow she didn't even know was there. I spent most of Friday night checking the locks on my apartment and watching the street from my window. The red blinking light of the tracker I smashed was still in my mind, but I didn't want to tell Alex yet. She had enough to deal with after the board meeting. By Saturday morning, I decided I wouldn't let a black SUV or a hidden camera ruin the first normal day we had planned. I packed a bag with snacks and headed to Lincoln Park. The morning air was crisp. Lincoln Park was full of runners and families walking their dogs. David stood near the entrance to the zoo area, holding Chloe's hand. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie, looking like any other dad on a weekend. Alex arrived in a cab a few minutes later. She was wearing leggings and a long quilted vest. It was the most casual he had ever seen her. "You made it," David said. "I wasn't sure if I should. I haven't been to this park in a long time," Alex said. "Look, Alex, there's a giant bridge over the water," Chloe said, pointing toward the nature boardwalk. "Can we go see the turtles?" "If Alex is up for the walk, we can go wherever you want, Chloe," David said. "I'm up for it." "The new prosthetic is actually feeling okay today," Alex said. They walked slowly toward the boardwalk. Chloe ran ahead, stopping every few feet to look at a flower or a bird. David didn't yell at her to hurry up. He didn't check his phone. Every time she stopped, he stopped. He would kneel down and look at whatever she was pointing at, talking to her like her discovery was the most important thing in the world. Alex watched them from a few steps behind. At the office, she was used to measuring every minute in dollars and efficiency. If a meeting went over by 5 minutes, she felt a surge of stress. But David seemed to have all the time in the world. "Does she always move this slowly?" Alex asked. "She's 6. Everything is new to her. If we rush to the turtles, she misses the grasshoppers. There's no point in coming to a park if you're only looking at the destination," David said. "I think I've spent my whole life only looking at the destination," Alex said. They reached the edge of the pond. Chloe leaned over the wooden railing, searching the lily pads. David stood right behind her, his hand on her shoulder to keep her steady. "I found one! He's huge!" Chloe yelled. "He is. He looks like he's been there a long time," David said. "Do you think he has a family, Dad?" "Maybe. Or maybe he's just enjoying the sun. Even turtles need a break sometimes." Alex sat down on a nearby bench. She looked at her leg, then at David. She had spent years hating her body for what it couldn't do. Brenda and her uncle had made her feel like her disability was a mathematical error that needed to be hidden behind a desk. But here, in the sun, David didn't look at her like a problem to be solved. He looked at her the same way he looked at Chloe, with patience. "David, come sit for a second," Alex said. David made sure Chloe was settled with her sketchbook before sitting next to Alex. "Is the leg hurting?" "No. I'm just thinking about work. About how I treat people," Alex said. "You're a CEO. You have to be tough. There's a difference between being tough and being a machine. I realize I've been acting like a machine because I was afraid that if I showed any humanity, people would think I was weak. But watching you with Chloe, you aren't weak because you're patient with her. It actually makes you stronger," Alex said. "I'm just a dad, Alex. I don't have a board of directors watching my every move. But you do. Chloe is your board of directors, and she clearly thinks you're doing a great job," Alex said. She looked at her hands. "I think I'm going to change some things on Monday. I want to be less of a shark. I want to be a person who works at a company, not just a title in a suit. I think the staff would like that, especially the ones in the warehouse," David said. I'm also going to stop being so hard on myself. I've been punishing myself for surviving that fire for 3 years. I thought if I worked until I collapsed, maybe I could earn my place back. But sitting here, I think I just want to enjoy the sun, too. David reached over and placed his hand on hers. You've already earned your place. You don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. Thank you, David, for inviting me today. I needed to see this side of life again, Alex said. They spent another hour in the park. They got ice cream from a small stand near the zoo entrance. Chloe got chocolate all over her face, and Alex laughed a real, loud laugh that made people nearby turn and look. It wasn't the polite laugh she used at galas. It was the sound of someone who was finally starting to heal. As the sun began to climb higher, David noticed the crowd getting thicker. He started to feel that familiar itch in the back of his neck. He looked toward the parking lot and saw a dark glint through the trees. We should probably head back, David said. Already? Chloe wanted to see the lions, Alex said. I think she's had enough excitement for one day, and I told Marcus I'd drop off some things for him, David said. He didn't tell her he had seen a black SUV parked near the exit. He didn't tell her he had seen a man in a gray jacket taking photos of them from behind a tree. He kept his voice steady and his smile in place for Chloe. They walked back to the entrance. David helped Alex into a cab and waited until it pulled away before walking toward his own car. He buckled Chloe into her seat and started the engine. Did you have fun today, Dad? Chloe asked. I had a lot of fun, sweetheart. I like Alex. She has a pretty laugh. I like it too, David said. He pulled out of the parking lot and checked his rearview mirror. The black SUV pulled out 2 cars behind him. David took a sharp right turn onto a side street. The SUV followed. He took a left, then another right. The SUV was still there, maintaining a steady distance. David's phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a private number. He answered it, putting it on speaker so he could keep both hands on the wheel. Hello? You had a nice morning at the park, David, a voice said. It was deep and distorted, clearly using a scrambling app. It's a shame it has to end. Who is this? If you have a problem with me, leave my daughter out of it, David said. I don't have a problem with you. You're just a tool. But tools can be broken. Tell Alexandra that some secrets don't stay buried in Gold Coast fires. Tell her we're coming for the rest of the puzzle. The line went dead. David looked in the mirror. The black SUV sped up, swerving around a slow-moving van. It was moving fast, aiming straight for David's rear bumper. Dad, why is that car driving so fast? Chloe asked, her voice shaking. Hold on tight, Chloe, David said, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. We're going to take a little shortcut. David slammed his foot on the gas and steered the car toward the narrow, winding alleys of North Clark Street, the roar of the SUV's engine growing louder behind them. He knew the city better than they did, but he was driving a 10-year-old sedan, and they were driving a tank. He realized then that Howard Vance was just the beginning. The real enemy was someone who knew exactly where they were, every second of the day. David managed to lose the black SUV by weaving through the narrow, one-way alleys behind North Clark Street. He spent the rest of the weekend at a safe house Marcus provided, barely sleeping as he finalized the logistics audit. He knew that Monday morning wouldn't just be about his job. It would be the day Alex either solidified her power or lost everything. By 9 a.m. on Monday, the boardroom on the 60th floor was full. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and cold coffee. David stood at the very back of the room near the water cooler. He was wearing his old suit, but he stood tall. Alex sat at the head of the table. She looked calm. Her hands rested on a thick leather folder. Howard Vance sat to her right, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. Before we begin the quarterly review, Howard said, standing up. He didn't look at Alex. He looked at the board members. We need to address a serious lapse in leadership, specifically the hiring of David Miller. Alex didn't interrupt. She simply watched him. Mr. Miller was hired without a proper vetting process, Howard continued. He has a massive gap in his resume and no executive history. My investigation shows he is a personal friend of the CEO. They have been seen together at cafes and parks. This is a clear violation of our ethics code. It's favoritism, plain and simple. A few board members whispered among themselves. Howard tossed a set of photos onto the table. They were the pictures from Lincoln Park. David helping Alex walk, Chloe laughing. "Is this true, Alexandra?" the chairman asked. "Did you hire a friend and bypass HR protocols?" Alex stood up slowly. She didn't look at the photos. "I hired a man who was qualified for a role that our HR department was failing to fill. As for my personal life, it has no bearing on the performance of this company. However, the performance of Mr. Miller does." She opened her folder and slid a stack of reports across the table. "In the 90 days since David Miller took over the Midwest distribution hub, we have seen a 14% increase in shipping speed, but more importantly, he discovered a systemic leak in our inventory tracking." Howard's smile faltered. "Mr. Miller conducted a full audit of Sector C," Alex said, her voice steady. "He found that hundreds of thousands of dollars in solar inverters were being marked as damaged and moved out of the facility at night. By restructuring the digital ledger and implementing real-time tracking, Mr. Action Miller has saved Vance Enterprises $12 million in projected annual losses." The room went dead, silent. $12 million was a number no one could ignore. The chairman picked up the report and flipped through the pages. "This data is verified?" the chairman asked. "Every cent," Alex said. "Mr. Miller didn't just do his job. He fixed a problem that has been draining this company for 3 years. I didn't hire a friend, Howard. I hired the only person in this city honest enough to tell me the truth about my own warehouse." Howard cleared his throat, his face turning a dark shade of red. "The inventory loss is a separate issue. We are talking about the integrity of the CEO's office. You can't just hire people you meet in coffee shops." "Actually, Howard," Alex said, leaning forward, "we should talk about the inventory loss. Because the digital ID used to authorize those damaged shipments belonged to you." Howard laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's ridiculous. Someone must have stolen my credentials. It's a setup." Just then, the heavy doors of the boardroom opened. Detective Rodriguez walked in. He wasn't wearing his usual security uniform. He was in a dark police suit. He walked straight to the table and placed a pair of handcuffs next to Howard's water glass. "Mr. Vance," Rodriguez said, "I'm Thumb 2 Rodriguez with the Financial Crimes Division. We've spent the weekend reviewing the Southside warehouse footage and your private offshore accounts. We have records of you selling that damaged inventory to a competitor in Ohio." Howard stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. "You can't do this. I am a Vance." "That's exactly why we're doing this quietly," Rodriguez said. "We can walk out of here through the lobby, or we can go through the service exit. It's your choice." Howard looked around the room. He looked at the board members, but they all turned their heads away. He looked at Alex, but she was already looking at the chairman. Finally, he looked at David in the back of the room. David didn't say anything. He just met Howard's gaze with a look of quiet resolve. "This isn't over," Howard hissed at Alex as Rodriguez took his arm. "It is for you," Alex replied. The board members watched in stunned silence as Howard was led out of the room. Rodriguez didn't make a scene. He just kept his hand on Howard's shoulder and walked him out. The door clicked shut, leaving the room in a heavy, awkward silence. The chairman looked at Alex. "It seems we owe you an apology, Alexandra. And Mr. Miller as well." "I don't need an apology," Alex said, sitting back down. "I need to finish this meeting. We have a company to run." For the next 2 hours, David watched from the shadows as Alex took total control of the room. She was no longer the woman crying on the floor or the girl hiding behind crutches. She was a leader. When the meeting finally adjourned, the board members shook her hand one by one. David waited until the room was empty before walking toward her. Alex was still sitting at the head of the table. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright. She looked up at David, and a small smile touched her lips. "You did it," David said. "We did it," Alex corrected him. "Thank you, David. I couldn't have faced them without that report, or without you. I'm just glad it's over. I was worried Rodriguez wouldn't get the bank records in time." "It's a good start," Alex said. She stood up and reached for her bag. "But I think I'm done with this office for today. I want to go get Chloe and find a place that doesn't have a mahogany table. I think Marcus is bringing her to the park. We could meet them there." Alex nodded. She walked toward David, and for a second it looked like she was going to say something else, but she just gripped his hand for a moment before heading toward the door. David followed her to the elevator. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt since the day they met. Howard was gone, the job was secure, and Alex was finally free of the shadows in her own company. As they stepped into the elevator, Alex's phone buzzed. She pulled it out and frowned. "What is it?" David asked. "It's a message from an unknown number," Alex said. She showed him the screen. It was a photo of the three of them, David, Alex, and Chloe, sitting at Sawada Coffee on that very first Saturday. But there was a red circle drawn around Chloe's face. Under the photo, there was a single line of text. "Howard was just the distraction. The real debt is still unpaid. We'll be seeing the girls soon." The elevator doors opened into the lobby, but neither of them moved. David felt the air in the small space turn cold. He realized then that the black SUV and the tracker weren't Howard's. Howard was a thief. But the person who sent this was something much worse. David stepped in front of Alex, his eyes scanning the crowded lobby for any sign of a gray jacket or a dark lens. The purge wasn't over. It had just moved from the boardroom to his own front door. The investigation into the threats against Chloe had lasted nearly 4 months. Thamtu Rodriguez eventually traced the distorted calls and the tracker back to a group of investors. Howard had cheated years ago. They thought targeting Alex's new family was the fastest way to get their money back. With Howard behind bars and his associates facing federal charges, the shadows finally retreated. The black SUVs disappeared from the corners of Logan Square, and David finally stopped checking his rearview mirror every time he drove Chloe to school. It was another Saturday morning in late March. The Chicago winter was finally losing its grip, and the first hints of spring sun were hitting the pavement on Green Street. David parked the car and held the door open for Chloe. She was 7 now, taller and carrying a thick sketchbook under her arm. "Is it the same table, Dad?" Chloe asked. "I hope so," David said. "It's been a long year. It's only right we go back to where it started." They walked into Sawada Coffee. The smell of steam and roasted beans was exactly the same. The shop was crowded, just as it had been a year ago. People were hunched over laptops and couples were whispering over lattes. David scanned the room and saw a woman sitting at table 7 by the window. Alex wasn't wearing a charcoal blazer or a sharp bun. She had on a thick, cream-colored oversized sweater, and her hair was down, falling over her shoulders. Her crutches were leaned against the brick wall behind her. She was looking at her phone, but when she saw them walk in, she didn't just smile. She stood up, balancing herself easily on her new prosthetic, and waited for them to reach her. "You're late," Alex said. "The red line was delayed," David said. And Chloe couldn't find her green crayon. Alex laughed and pulled Chloe into a hug. "I have a whole box of new ones in my bag. Sit down. I already ordered the drinks." David sat in the same chair he had occupied a year ago. He looked at the table. There was a large hot cocoa with extra whipped cream for Chloe, a black coffee for him, and a ginger tea for Alex. There was also a small chocolate cake with a single candle sitting in the middle. "It's not my birthday," Alex said, seeing David's look. "But it is the anniversary of the day I asked a stranger for a seat. I thought we should celebrate." "I think that's a good reason for cake," David said. Chloe immediately opened her sketchbook. "Look, Alex, I drew our new house. I put your office on the first floor so you don't have to use the stairs if your leg is tired." Alex took the book and looked at the drawing. "I love it, Chloe, especially the blue door. Dad says we can paint it whatever color you want," Chloe said. "Then blue it is," Alex said. They sat there for a long time. The conversation was easy. They talked about David's new role as the director of global operations. He had moved out of the warehouse and into the main tower, but he still spent his Friday afternoons on the floor with the drivers. They talked about Alex's decision to delegate more of the board meetings to Mrs. Higgins, so she could be home for dinner by 6. They didn't talk about Howard. They didn't talk about the fire or the tracker or the fear. In this space, those things didn't exist. Alex reached across the table and placed her hand on top of David's. Her skin was warm. David turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. A group of college students at the next table were looking for a place to sit. One of them looked at their table, then at Alex's crutches, and then at David. David didn't look away. He didn't feel the need to explain who they were or why they were there. He just squeezed Alex's hand. The student eventually moved on to the back of the room. "Do you remember what you said at the interview?" Alex asked quietly. "Which part?" "I said a lot of things. You said you knew the value of a seat when everyone else was telling you to keep moving," Alex said. "I think about that every time I walk into the boardroom now. I stopped trying to be a shark, David. I'm just trying to make sure everyone has a seat." "You're doing a good job," David said. "I'm happy," Alex said. She looked at Chloe, who was busy coloring the blue door in her drawing. "I didn't think I'd ever say that again and mean it. I thought I was just going to be a CEO until I died. I didn't think there was a seat for me anywhere else." "There was always a seat," David said. "You just had to ask." The sun grew brighter, filling the corner of the cafe with a soft, golden light. For the first time in his life, David didn't feel like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He had his daughter, he had a job he was proud of, and he had a woman who looked at him like he was the only person in the world. They finished the cake together. Chloe licked the frosting off her fork, and Alex wiped a stray crumb from David's chin. They looked like any other family in Chicago. There was no grand declaration. There was no audience. There was just the quiet safety of being known. As they started to gather their things to leave, the heavy front door of the cafe opened. A man in a dark trench coat walked in. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look for a seat. He walked straight toward table 7 and stopped a few feet away. David felt the familiar tension return to his shoulders. He stood up, stepping slightly in front of Alex. The man didn't reach for a weapon. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old photograph. He laid it on the table in front of Alex. It was a photo of two young men standing in front of the Vance building 40 years ago. One was Alex's father. The other was the man standing in front of them now. "My name is Thomas," the man said. His voice was raspy. "I was your father's partner before the Gold Coast fire. I've been looking for you for a long time, Alexandra." Alex stood up, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "My father didn't have a partner. He ran the company alone." "That's what your uncle wanted everyone to believe," Thomas said. He looked at David, then back at Alex. "I didn't come here to cause trouble, but there is something you need to know about that fire. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a gas leak." David looked at the photo, then at the man's eyes. He saw a deep, old pain there that he recognized. "Then what was it?" David asked. Thomas looked around the crowded cafe, his eyes landing on the crutches leaning against the wall. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was a purge, and the person who started it is still sitting on your board of directors." The man turned and walked out of the cafe before either of them could speak. Alex stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the old photo on the table. David reached for her hand, but she didn't feel it. Outside, the Chicago sun was still shining, but the warmth was gone. David looked out the window and saw Thomas disappear into the crowd. He realized then that the table they had built was still missing one very important piece of the truth. And that is our story for tonight. Before you go to sleep, thank you so much for staying with us until the very end and for sharing in the journey of David, Alex, and Chloe. We hope their story brought a little bit of warmth to your evening. We would love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever experienced a moment where 5 simple words or one small act of kindness from a stranger changed the direction of your life? Please share your thoughts and reflections with us in the comments. The lesson we carry away tonight is a simple yet profound one. Kindness is a bridge that connects broken worlds. In a city as busy as Chicago, and in a life as fast as ours, it is easy to keep our heads down and tell others that the seat is taken. But David showed us that when we choose to make room at our table, we aren't just sharing a space, we are offering a piece of our heart. Family is not always defined by the blood in our veins. It is defined by the people who choose to stand by us when we are at our weakest. May we all find the courage to pull out a chair for someone in need. And may we all be lucky enough to find a table 7 to call our own. Thank you for being here. Sleep well, and remember that one small gesture can change a life forever. Good night.